Welcome everyone to this David Lynas Consulting webinar, The Business of Risk. And wherever you're joining us from in the world, you're very welcome indeed. For those who have not previously used our platform, either for previous DLC webinars or for COSAC, a couple of very quick points. On the bottom of your window, you will see an Ask a Question button. Please do ask questions. I love difficult questions. There's a value add in that system. You can upvote and downvote other people's questions so that in the time available, we deal with it in priority order as you see it. You'll also see a poll button, and there's already a poll loaded, which we're going to go into pretty much immediately. Your answers to the polls are anonymous. They're not attributed. It's the collective answer that we're interested in. So, I looked through the attendance list. Many of you already know me. If you do not, then the only thing that's really important is that I've spent my entire life in the field of information security, but I am, of course, a business owner and a CEO. And it's from that perspective that I'm going to talk through this particular webinar. Let's start with the uncomfortable premise. There is a poll live which asks your opinion on a range of perfect or scale of perfect to terrible. How good do you think your enterprise risk method is? And of course, while you're answering that, the premise is that business is critically dependent upon effective and fit for purpose risk management to make well-informed decisions. But risk is complicated. The great author Terry Pratchett said there are three kinds of manager in this world. One who can tell me what has happened, one who can tell me what is happening, and one who considers the other two to lack ambition. Risk management involves fortune telling. It involves staring into the crystal ball and determining what will happen in the future. And that's very difficult. It's even more difficult to get buy-in and budget and investment in uncertain events. And we're going to deal with that through the course of the presentation. Here's my premise. The approach and process and structures that we often use have not been updated or adapted for the dynamic, agile, modern world in which we live and operate. Risk management is broken. And the answers to the polls, 0% saying it's perfect, could be improved, 55%, that's fairly confident, 25% saying it's terrible, and 10% saying it causes more problems than it solves. That's good. I guess that's why you're here, because it's not perfect. Now we can go to work in the morning, bury our head in the sand, brush under the carpet the fact that there are flaws and deficiencies, or we can try to do something to make it better. And that's what I'm going to try to do today. So having bombarded you with two cliches in one sentence, let's grab the bull by the horns. And that itself is, of course, not a very comfortable experience often. What we're going to deal with is the business of risk. What is risk really? What role does it play in business? We'll look at the processes of risk management. We'll look at what really matters and the difficult task of assigning ownership to what really matters. And we look at the structures of risk context, risk architecture, and risk strategy, as well as through life management. Very briefly, of course. I've spent my whole adult life in information security, so I'm going to start with definitions from that sector. ISC squared. Excuse me. Risk is the possibility of damage or harm and the likelihood that damage or harm will be realized. NIST says it's the level of impact on organizational operations, including mission, functions, image, or reputation, organizational assets, or individuals, resulting from the operation of an information system, given the potential impact of a threat and the likelihood of that threat occurring. Notice anything? Damage, harm, impact, threats. Our sector has a complete obsession with negatives. All of the focus is on damage and pain and failure. The proposition is that risk is a very bad thing and we must be very afraid and we must avoid it. Problem number one. Fear, uncertainty, and doubt is difficult to sell. As a CEO, my response might be, I don't believe you. It'll never happen here. And you give me examples of how it happened to others, and I'll say, but yes, but we're better than them, right? Anyway, I fell for this trick before. In the past, multiple times, you asked me for investment about an uncertain event in the future, and the uncertain event didn't happen. So clearly your scaremongering was a waste of effort. At this time of year, it starts with the North Americans in November with their Black Friday sales. Prices then go back to normal for the holiday period, and then in January, there are massive sales to get rid of stock. And the proposition is save money. Save money. Here's a pair of boots that yesterday cost $300. Today they cost $100. Save $200. Really? Am I saving $200? Or am I spending $100, possibly on something that I didn't need? Prevention of loss is a false return on investment. The proposition is give me lots of money so that you won't lose lots of money. Huh? And being in security, throughout 40 years, I've heard this a lot. Think of it as insurance. You have to treat the risks in case something goes wrong. Well, I'm a bit of a selfish, self-centered old so-and-so. Life insurance is of no benefit to me. I'm dead. And I really don't care about anybody else. You see, the truth about risk is that all living things depend upon it for survival and success. What differentiates humans or a tree from a slab of concrete is the ability to take risk. Now, I've deliberately chosen two contentious examples because they're debated. The idea that life originated in primordial soup is debated. It is not debated that Homo erectus stepped into the unknown, took a risk of moving into the unknown and leaving Africa. But what is debated is why they took that risk. And maybe it was about development or learning or curiosity. What's on the other side of the river? What's beyond the horizon? Possibly it was about environmental or climate change or a need to adapt in some way. It's also possible it was fight or flight, that it was dangerous to remain in situ, and therefore we have to take the risk of going somewhere else. Isn't that an extraordinary thing? We spend most of our careers saying, remove the risk so that you will be safer. But in fact, we take risk to be safer. Whatever the truth is about the reasons for Homo erectus taking this risk, it comes down to making things better. We take risk to make things better. We must take risk. Without it, we cannot possibly succeed. It is the only possible way to grasp opportunities. Business demands that we take risk to make things better. Think about your business context. How much of it is focused on preventing bad things versus achieving something. New products, increased market share, more customers. CEOs don't report to the board on all the things that we're going to stop this year. This negative obsession simply isn't business aligned. All of our stakeholders have objectives, performance targets, annual appraisals, bonuses that are built around the idea that we grasp opportunities and deliver value. Very rarely are those things based on preventing bad things from happening. It's a business necessity. We simply must take risks to be able to innovate, to grow, to adapt. Telling our stakeholders not to do so is entirely contrary to everything that their own bosses are telling them to do. They are paid to take risk. Risk is the means to achieve anything. Leo Buscaglia, Dr. Love, said the greatest risk is to risk nothing at all. And Norman Vincent Peale, who's the man behind the positive thinking movement, the greatest risk in life is to risk nothing. The person who risks nothing, does nothing, has nothing, is nothing, and becomes nothing. We must take risks. We love risk. So let's look at slightly more balanced definitions, slightly wider interpretations beyond security. The UK government says risk is an uncertain event or set of events which, should it occur, will have an effect on the achievement of objectives. And those events could be positive and they could be negative. ISO 31000, which originated in Australia and New Zealand, the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And recently I discovered the Society for Risk Assessment, which is a huge multi-sectoral viewpoint. It has 8 different definitions for risk. What they have in common is that they are with respect to something that we value. Think about what happens when we take risk. Our brain releases endorphins, neurotransmitters that help us cope with pain and stress and provide adrenaline. And when we survive the risk, the brain releases dopamine to celebrate, triumph, look how successful we are. The reality is that we enjoy overcoming risk to reach our objectives. We enjoy setting objectives that involve taking risks. And if we don't have enough risk in our lives because health and safety legislation has gone too far, then we invent ways to take risk. We invent bungee jumping because we love these endorphins and dopamine. The reality is, to understand risk properly, yes, part of it is about preventing bad things from happening, but a huge proportion of it is about ensuring success. And in the SABSA methodology, risk is defined as a positive or negative effect of uncertain events on what we value most. So key point number 1, embrace risk. One of the greatest risks we face is our failure to understand the very nature of risk itself. Rather than fear and avoid it, we should embrace it, recognize the critical role that it plays in enterprise and stakeholder success. Our role should not be, we will remove risk. Our role should be, we will help you to take risk. Now that mindset has significant implications for the way in which we manage risk. Second bullet point for you. What is the focus of your organization's risk assessments? Do you focus only on negatives, threats, vulnerabilities, and damage, pain, negative impacts? Or do you also focus on the balance of positives, opportunities, strengths, and benefits? I'll come back and revisit that in a moment, but currently it's 100% negative. ISO 31000, our own standard, says the very purpose of risk management is to achieve an appropriate balance between realizing opportunities for gains while minimizing loss. Balance is the entire purpose. And yet here we are as a profession currently voting 93% that we model only one half of that equation. We model only the possible loss, which doesn't align with business. Whatever method you use, the risk management structure looks something like this, give or take some terminology. And the point is that all risk treatment decisions should be traceable to context. And that enterprise context, as we just said, is focused largely on success, not prevention of failure. We often lack ambition. There's a bad smell, so we spray an air freshener, an aerosol, to disguise the smell. We might be a little bit more adventurous and build very fancy systems with which we can overcome the bad smell. But that's still losing connection to context. What happens to give me a good smell? I didn't go into business to prevent a bad smell. I went into business to generate good smells, metaphorically. So despite expending enormous resources, modern risk management processes have often lost sight of the business context. They deliver false priorities, and they result in outcomes that simply lack ambition. Is it possible that we have lost sight of what we're trying to achieve, that we can no longer see the forest for the trees? The objective is to generate the greatest possible benefit by informing decisions in priority order, to rate possible events and their effect on what matters with the greatest possible credibility of rating in the shortest possible time with the least possible effort. Is it possible that the process has overcome the objective? We have bombarded people with checklists of a risk management process. Of course, what I'm saying is, as always, not new. You can go back to the ancient Greeks. In Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus had advance warning of a threat. The siren's beautiful song was a trap. And once you hear that song and move towards it, you can never escape. Now, the sensible option was to go somewhere else, but that would have risked the success of the mission. The impractical option was to ignore the threat intelligence completely and just keep sailing. But that, of course, risked catastrophe. So he filled the crew's ears with wax, had himself tied to the mast so that he could not move towards the siren song, but he could evaluate it. That is a business-driven risk decision. It's all about maximizing the gain, to enable the mission by taking a well-informed, holistic risk-balance decision. So point number 2, when our risk management processes are focused only on reducing the risk of failure, we have missed the point. And to rub salt into the wound, we are displaying a distinct lack of business ambition. The outcome, the desired outcome of risk management is to enable the enterprise to take risk, to maximize the probability of success. But what does success look like? Well, here are 10 stakeholders. What really matters to each of these stakeholders? As examples, excuse me. To the CEO, the market must have confidence that we can meet our targets, and to grow, we need customers to trust our reputation and brand. Head of operations, we must collaborate to provide our customers with a superior experience and innovate products and services. We must be resilient to inevitable change. Head of finance, our shareholders expect that we are profitable. All initiatives must provide ROI, and all operations must be cost effective. Manufacturing says we are at our most productive when our work progresses as planned and moves through the production plant without delay. And in doing so, we must keep our workers safe. Data compliance. We're subject to many regulations and laws in a variety of jurisdictions. We must comply or risk fines or even losing our license to operate. Data quality says quality is everything. If we don't have product and process quality, our market share will fall. Audit, all about effectiveness, efficiency, and economy. The CIO, business depends upon information and systems to be available when we need them and operate correctly. The CISO says let's protect the confidentiality of business information, the privacy of customer information, and the integrity of all information. And the head of digital transformation says we must transform to early and continuous delivery of value and find better ways to develop working software. Risk to what matters is a complex thing. What matters to different stakeholders is at a very wide range of levels. And this is a perfect example of a complex system. Complex system composed of many different parts that are interdependent, that interact, that are conflicted. It's an organic ecosystem. Each part of the enterprise has its own success factors and methods and risks and opportunities, and it innovates and behaves accordingly. And the enterprise as a whole, and indeed all of its individual parts, also interact with the ever-changing world in which it exists. So the definition of a complex enterprise is that it cannot be defined by reference to its constituent parts alone, because no part is completely independent of the behavior of all of the other parts. And we interpret that complexity as a complex risk system. The risk to what really matters in a complex system cannot be defined by reference to the risks of its constituent parts alone, because no part is completely independent of the risks to all of the other parts. They interact, they have systemic relationships. And this is a very complex environment in which we live. There are objectives and goals and targets and requirements and drivers. In my sample list of 10 statements, there's a clear confusion between what we want to achieve and how we will achieve it. There are different organizational levels and perspectives and viewpoints, and each and every one of them has culturally specific jargon and nomenclature. Some are focused on strategic goals, some are operational, some are in between. So clearly we need a way to normalize definable, measurable means of articulating requirements and risks so that we can cross all of these borders within the complex system, so that each element can understand all of the other elements and overcome the specialist jargon. And in the SABSA methodology, that's called attributes profiling, a normalized, measurable, in-context definition of what is important. So we model these statements of what's important with normalized, measurable, definable things. The CEO, what really matters to the CEO is reputable, brand, confident, and trusted. And each has a definition, and we ask the CEO, how much of that do you want? What's your performance target, and what's your risk appetite? The CEO, collaborative, innovative, resilient, for example. CFO, profitable, ROI, cost-effective, productive, throughput, safety, compliance, quality, effective, efficient, economic, available, timely, functional, confidential, private, integrity assured, time to market, valuable, and agile, as examples, of course. So, a couple of points, 3 or 4 important points about how this technique works. The first is that in the SABSA methodology, we replace the asset register with the register of all of the things that are important. Because asset registers don't have reputation or safety or confidence. The premise being that sometimes we conduct risk assessment on a very flawed basis because we're not performing risk assessment on the basis of what really matters. The second point is that each of those attributes in this normalized language is measurable, and that creates risk appetite. Customer satisfaction, for example, measured by surveying customers about their online experience. They rate our website, our ordering system from 1 to 5 stars, and our performance target is, for example, we want a satisfaction rating of 4.5. But every performance target in the universe is a flip side risk appetite threshold. So if we want 4.5 stars, we are prepared to accept the loss of 0.5 stars. And any growth beyond 4.5 stars is clearly a benefit. The next point is that we build a dependency tree from all of these things that are important. So the CEO wanted reputation, and that depends upon quality and customer experience and health and safety record and having great products and so on. So we can now distribute risk appetite and performance targets down through the dependency tree using this normalized language that everyone understands. And we can also aggregate performance and understanding back up again. So key point number 3. The risk to what really matters in a complex system cannot be managed by managing the risks of the constituent parts independently. To make informed decisions in the modern complex world, we need a way to cross all of the borders of specialist nomenclature and different levels of abstraction. We need a common language. And in the SABSA world, that's called attributes. But when all the constituent parts interact in a complex system, who makes the decision? Well, here's a third poll. How clear and obvious is risk ownership in your organization? Is it crystal clear, fairly well understood and generally accepted without resistance? Often resisted, but we get there in the end, or avoided like the plague? And the votes at the moment are 50-50 between, it's changing dramatically as I speak. We've now gone to 66% resisted. We've got about 20% we get generally accepted without resistance, and 33% avoided like the plague. Once again, no one has voted for crystal clear. No one. And yet, without clear risk ownership, how do we ever get anything done? Never mind get it done really quickly in the agile world in which we exist. Which takes us to my favorite 17th century poem. All of you who've been on SABSA courses will recognize this, of course. For want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For want of a shoe, the horse was lost. For want of a horse, the rider was lost. For want of a rider, the message was lost. For want of a message, the battle was lost. For want of a battle, the whole kingdom was lost, and all for the want of one tiny little horseshoe nail. But how exactly does the king manage horseshoe nail risk? And the reality is the king knows nothing about horseshoe nails. The enterprise is dependent upon horseshoe nails, but the risk context for horseshoe nails differs completely from the enterprise context. So we must have a way to calibrate risk context to provide clear ownership. Revisiting the complex system. Lots of different levels of enterprise, jurisdiction, multinational, teams, departments, different aspects, like technology or process or people, different properties like security and quality, many different layers of abstraction, infrastructure, containers, systems, functions, and of course, external interactions like regulators, partners, and customers. The reality is that we have many different interested parties accountable and responsible for many interrelated elements. And each and every one of them uses their own models, nomenclature, and patterns. They focus on their own silo of interest. And that creates a situation where people avoid ownership. When you present an unfamiliar nomenclature or pattern or model, I don't understand. That's a foreign language, can't be my problem. And anyway, I'm too busy dealing with my own issues. It's hard enough to get through the day without you adding more problems. So the second key part of SABSA architecture is called a domain. It is a word derived from the word dominion. It represents dominion of authority, a set of elements, area of knowledge or activity subject to the common dominion of a single accountable authority. Many SABSA people seem to think this applies to an org chart. It doesn't. It's the common structure that allows all of these diverse perspectives of the enterprise to be interrelated and modeled. The domain could be an organizational unit, it could be a system, it could be a process, it could be a classification. There are rules. A dominion of authority has a single authority, and that authority is accountable for the risk to and performance of the domain. An accountable authority, like the king, may delegate risk appetite or performance targets to a specialist authority at a lower level, and that creates a dependency, compliance, and service relationship, a subdomain upon which the domain depends for success. So the superdomain authorizes the subdomain, and subdomains are responsible to the superdomain for compliance to the delegated appetite or meeting the targets. So we've got two important constructs that we're going to build upon. The first is an attribute, which is the normalized language for defining what really matters. The second is the domain, the normalized structure for defining authority for what really matters. And together, those are going to play a vital role in creating meaningful risk ownership. As an example, here in a business domain, we have someone who is accountable for customer satisfaction. And we can build a dependency tree across multiple different perspectives. In this case, my example uses people, process, and systems, but there could be many other perspectives. So customer satisfaction depends upon accessibility, accurate, culture, sensitivity, and private in the people domain, architecture open, integrated, protected in the system domain, and so on. We can see across the borders of complexity. Point number 4 then. Risk ownership is vague, it's difficult, it's confused, it creates delays to decision making, it results in inappropriate decisions by people who shouldn't be making that decision, and it creates barriers to progress. And the simple domain modeling technique provides the clarity of risk ownership and authority over what really matters and enables rapid decision making through complexity. But earlier I said risk decisions must be made in context from ISO 31000. And then I said the context of the kingdom and the horseshoe nails are very different. So how does that work? ISO 31000 says to establish risk context means to define the external and internal parameters that organizations must consider when they manage risk. Lovely. That's a little bit vague though. So they split it into internal and external parameters. Internally our stakeholders, our approach to governance, our internal relationships, capabilities, culture, and standards. We can affect internal risk context. So any domain authority has authority over their own domain. By definition, they are in charge of setting the risk appetite, setting the performance targets, assigning budget and resources, and so on. External risk context are the influences from outside that dominion of authority, such as legislation or a target set by the boss. The problem is that the organization is complex and there's a large volume of interacting and interconnected stakeholders and risks and approaches and capabilities. And it creates this situation. We spend lots of effort doing a 600-page long system-based risk report, and we discover the horrors of a zero-day exploit, and we pass it off to Madam Business Person and say, here you go, you own the risk of a zero-day exploit. And she says, I can't even spell exploit. What on earth possesses you to think I own this risk? Reality for many people on this webinar, I'm quite sure. Now, what's happening is that we are failing to architect risk. We have a tendency to throw all of the elements in one bucket, despite all of these varied areas of interest and responsibility and levels of abstraction. Excuse me. This business owner does not own the risk of zero-day exploits, just as the king doesn't own the risk of horseshoe nails. It's being distributed. An authority has been delegated. We build a system of understanding real ownership. We build a lens on authority's view through complexity. The domain defines the type and scope of dominion. The attributes define what really matters. But remember that that domain is not in isolation. It's in a complex structure. So the domain's risk and performance are dependencies of its superdomain, which is why the domain even exists in the first place, to serve that superdomain. It may have an interdependency with its peers, and it may depend upon its own subdomains to which it has delegated performance targets. And that's all a domain authority cares about. They don't care about the huge picture of every risk we can imagine. They care only about dependencies and dependents to define their internal and external context. And we can do that at any level of position of the organization. That's how we sort out this complex bucket. Here, for example, the attribute customer satisfaction. And the performance target and risk example for that domain authority is distributed to a dependency called system availability. The business domain authority is accountable for ensuring that the system domain on which they depend has proper budget, is properly resourced, and so on. And the system domain authority is accountable for the risk performance of the attribute system availability. They have authority for managing all of the relevant threats and vulnerabilities within the budget, resources, and parameters established. So when the system domain does a risk assessment and discovers the threat of a distributed denial of service attack, that is not a threat to the business. That is a threat to the system domain's attribute called system availability. It is the system owner who is accountable for managing that particular risk, not the business domain that depends upon it. In fact, it is the loss of the attribute system availability that is the threat to the business domain. The impact to the subdomain's attribute is a threat event from the perspective of the superdomain. And I'm sure you've all looked at risk reports at some point in your career that someone else has written, and you've looked at the indexes and gone, that's not a threat, that's a vulnerability. That's not a threat, that's an impact. That impact is in fact a vulnerability, and it's all confused. And this is the technique for sorting it out. It also, of course, works with benefit. Any benefit to a subdomain is an opportunity for the superdomain. So risk context is everything. It's often distorted, confused, resisted, creates failure to buy in because the king couldn't care less about horseshoe nails. That's the reality. Domains and attribute dependency models together enable us to accurately scope and communicate context to the right person, to be very clear on what events, states, positive or negative consequences are meaningful to each, to create understanding, buy-in, and investment. Final poll for you. Does your organization manage risk in silos? Many organizations will split up risk into various classifications or compartmentalize it in some form, like operational risk or financial risk, health and safety, strategic, technical, supply chain, reputational, project, procurement. We could go on and on and on. And again, no one is voting for no. We've got 90% saying yes and 10%-ish saying sometimes. So clearly that is also a statement of reality. But that is another cognitive and behavioral trap. If there's a risk associated with taking a course of action, there's a risk of not taking the course of action, and the impact may not be on the same domain that made the decision. Risks interact. If you mitigate a risk in a domain, you almost certainly increase at least one other type of risk at the same time, possibly in a different domain. And for any domain authority, it's the balance, the integrated view of risk that matters, seeing through the silos. A couple of examples. Forgive me for the repeat from a SABSA Foundation course for some of you. A nightclub in the United Kingdom. The owner of the nightclub said to the manager, "Someone's stealing my money. Look at the reports. My bar takings are consistent, but the cover charge has gone off a cliff. That doesn't make any sense. I can't have fewer and fewer people coming into the nightclub coincidentally spending more money at the bar. Someone's stealing my cover charge and I want my money." And the manager did a quick look around to try to find the thief. It was not the staff, it was the customers. Customers would pay their admission fee at the front door, run straight to the fire exit, open the fire exit, and call their friends in from the alleyway around the back. So to treat the financial risk in the financial risk domain, they padlocked the fire exit. That's the UK's worst ever nightclub disaster. Hundreds of people died in that fire. Catastrophic health and safety impact from a financial risk treatment. It can work the other way around. I want my business to grow. I want to invest. I want to acquire a subsidiary or look at partnerships around the world. When's the last time your health and safety auditors looked at the contents of your computer system as opposed to the ergonomics of the chair and the radiation from the screen? Never? Because it's nothing to do with them, is it? Oh, really? Because I, as a CEO, have identified that the best way to grow my company is to open a subsidiary in Afghanistan, which, according to the Institute for Economics and Peace's annual Global Peace Index, has for the last 3 years been the most dangerous country on earth. My flight details are on a computer system. The information about the driver picking me up at the airport is on a computer system. My hotel reservation is on a computer system. My dinner reservation is on a computer system. You don't think that represents a health and safety risk? I do. Big companies are terrible at understanding risk on an enterprise basis across silos. And there are many, many, many other examples. We've a lot of Australians with us today, and thanks for joining us. You will be more familiar than I am that in order to treat a pest on the sugarcane crops, Australia imported the cane toad. And the cane toad has now moved almost through Australia in its entirety, devastating the ecosystems of natural parks, wiping out local species. The same thing is happening in Norway. The Russians, in the war era, fearing a food shortage, flew some Alaskan king crabs into Russia. And those king crabs have now spawned and moved around the coastline and are devastating the natural ecosystems of northern Norway. These silos interact. That's the reality. Enterprise risk can come from apparently unrelated decisions across many different areas of a complex organization. It can mount up over time, it can be hidden for long periods, and no single staff group has the knowledge to manage risk across those silos. The network manager is simply not qualified to state the impact of the loss of network on any domain other than IT. Somewhere on the org chart, there's a research and development unit that the network manager never heard of. He or she is simply not qualified to determine the impact across those boundaries. So we need something to leverage the power of holistic, integrated, and aligned risk. You might think I'm being extreme when I say this is the difference, this capability is the difference between success and failure. Well, don't take my word for it. After the financial crisis, Harvard Business Review in 2012 said this was the difference between success and failure. Companies that could understand holistic integrated risk survived. Companies that delegated or relegated the risk management to a compliance checklist function in silos failed. And as part of that article, they interviewed one of the survivors, the chief risk officer from JP Morgan Chase. He said, interestingly, risk management is non-intuitive. It runs counter to individual and organizational biases. Active and cost-effective risk management requires managers to think systemically about the multiple categories of risk they face. Integrated, holistic risk capability increases authorities' awareness and understanding of both positive and negative implications and provides a much fuller picture to make informed decisions. Well, does your risk framework deliver that benefit? The Royal Institute of British Architects says, no matter the culture, sector, or environment, architecture processes remain the same, but differ in the methods required to complete them successfully. In other words, it doesn't matter if we are building the Burj Khalifa, or a sports stadium, or a thatched cottage in the country, or a place of worship. The process of architecture is the same. And any framework that claims to be an enterprise framework must therefore be scalable, must have the ability to calibrate it to any context, any level, to be consumed at every level and by every specialism. Because that's how enterprise frameworks become enterprise. You don't go live with enterprise. You have to start somewhere. And therefore, all of the models and methods must be applicable at any level. So, the selection of our kind of client scenarios. Pharmaceuticals company focused on manufacturing quality. Next generation railway concerned with safety. Telecommunications and infrastructure manufacturer seeking competitive advantage by declaring their code to be trusted. Central bank tasked with providing national financial resilience, a COO seeking assurance that cyber risk is adequately managed in digital transformation and DevOps and Agile, a CIO required to integrate security strategy with enterprise architecture, a CISO instructed to provide business value propositions. You're using NIST, using Stride, using MITRE, so what? It doesn't matter what the scope or scale or level of abstraction is, we can use the same architectural process, which is why we at David Lynas Consulting love SABSA so much, and why, of course, our business model is to have more SABSA masters than anybody else, because we can scale it to any problem. So key point number 6, attempting to manage risk complexity and silos is itself a major risk and a major constraint. But the enterprise view can only really ever be achieved with a framework that removes, resolves, integrates those silos at every level and every viewpoint. 2 last points to make. Strategy. I am, of course, a strategist, so I'm biased. But this is an immediate risk conflict. Stakeholders find it very difficult, a difficult proposition, to say, here is my baby, here is my strategy, I will champion a process that finds the problems. Successful strategy involves focusing resources and effort, whereas mitigating risk involves diversifying investment to go treat that risk. Leadership are reluctant to spend time and money now to deal with an uncertain event that might occur later when it's someone else's problem or delivers benefit to someone else. And focusing on threats and failures is entirely contrary to the can-do culture required by strategy. No one cares about a crisis until there is a crisis. It's a very difficult mindset to talk about future possibilities of storms while the sun is shining. Culture and human nature will beat strategy and policy every single time. So we need a fresh thinking for the interrelationship between strategy and risk management. You may remember this particular gentleman. My point being that risk management and compliance are totally different things. Tony Hayward became CEO of BP in 2007 and stated, "Safety is my top priority." Examples of his compliance rules to manage risk: coffee cups must have their lids closed while walking, and you should not text while driving equipment around the plant. Now, I'm not saying that those rules are inappropriate. What I am saying is that the same Tony Hayward, to whom safety was top priority, was still CEO of British Petroleum in 2010, when the Deepwater Horizon happened. The US Commission said, management failures cripple the ability of individuals to identify the risks they faced and to properly evaluate, communicate, and address them. Despite all the rhetoric and the money invested in it, risk management was treated as a compliance issue that could be solved with lots of rules. Risk management and compliance are not the same thing. In fact, strategy, almost by definition, renders policy and standards out of date. If you'll forgive my warped sense of humor. Dear boss, I have innovated a system that will blow your mind. It leverages technologies never before seen. It delivers astounding benefits far beyond your wildest dreams. Dear innovator, that is indeed marvelous news. Tell me, can I trust that this is safe from cyber risk? Oh yes, boss, you can go to sleep. Don't worry about it. Rest easy. I have ensured compliance with all of these ISO standards and NIST. I think you can read the dates for yourself. Oh, and just to be sure, I've researched every other standard I could find across the entire world, And guess what? Not a single one of them was written tomorrow. Excuse my rather weird sense of humor, but when it comes to strategy, the rules are an ass. When we innovate something for the future, managing risk by complying with something written in a completely different environment and time frame is not necessarily the right thing to do. When we innovate, it is incumbent upon us to also innovate the new rules. That's how we break the barriers to innovation, because strategy embraces risk. It even desires and welcomes risk. You can't manage future risk by a set of rules about what to do and what not to do. In fact, they create barriers because they encourage checklist mentality that inhibits innovation. Now that requires a special skill set, this thinking about risk in innovative terms rather than checklisting. Those who know me will know that Irish rugby is my kind of religion. And we had an interesting comment just a couple of days ago from an Irish rugby legend called Paul O'Connell. It appears that a job vacancy as the head of rugby and head coach at Province Munster will come up. And Paul O'Connell replied, "That's a bit like asking a guy who's good at pulling pints to run the bar." Strategic risk assessment is a different skill set. And if you're going to use SABSA approaches, please check the accreditation of the people who claim to have those competences. It's very easy to do. We have seen, unfortunately, instances even in RFPs of organizations claiming certification that they don't have. And we have individuals who are foundation certified presenting themselves as world leading masters. It's very easy to check, and it's quite important. So the penultimate point, rules-based risk management is a constraint, it's detrimental to growth, and it defeats strategic ambition. We need a fundamentally different risk management approach that provides fit-for-purpose principles and approaches that support the critical capability to adapt, be resilient to change, and embrace positive benefit. The strategist's eternal dilemma through life management: how to make strategy reality. Up at the strategic phase, we're trying to grasp future opportunities to make things better. We have to overcome constraints to adoption of these new principles, approaches, and rules. We're trying to transform in an agile way, flexible, collaborative, self-organizing, fast-changing, and early and continuous delivery of value. And then we have the DevOps and lean people and scrums and Kanban charts, all about removing the bottleneck constraints to creating value, and at the same time, retrospective fixes. And we've got the poor people in operations who are simply bombarded with demands typically far beyond capacity. Well, we must change, but this is indicative of a system under pressure. We have to cope with continuous planned change, tactical and strategic. There are always too many priorities. No matter whether your risk management standard has red, yellow, green, or 7 categories or 70 categories, there's always too many high priority risks. We have to find a way to prioritize it. There will always be a new normal, and everything changes all of the time. Each life cycle phase sees risk and opportunity in different ways, and one size simply doesn't fit all. So, you may be aware of technical debt, that necessary work gets delayed because we have a deadline, the work you must do tomorrow because you took a shortcut today, and the implied cost of rework caused by choosing an easy solution today. Well, each of the domain authorities in that life cycle, each phase of the life cycle is a domain. It has accountability for a set of processes or a set of elements. They're just time-based domains. At each point, we have strategists and people for transformation and DevOps people, and they are accountable for their own performance targets and objectives. And as with any complex system, each has dependencies and is dependent upon others with which they interact. When we fail to identify and resolve those dependencies, risk work doesn't flow through the work funnel, and we create risk debt, which is the same principle. We miss opportunities for benefits, and we fail to resolve significant exposures because of work overload. We see things on a risk register that stay there, risk reports that stay there for months or years on end and never get treated. The implied cost of the lost or delayed opportunities, or the impacts of a problem that should have been avoided, the cost and complexity of having to fix it later when the exposure becomes more urgent, or the opportunity starts to fade and we have to grab it before it's too late. Paying off the debt, in this case paying off the risk debt, not the technical debt. Ooh, that sounds familiar to me. Aren't those the goals of architecture? We often see architecture and DevOps and Agile as being diametrically opposed. Isn't it weird that we have lots in common? And when we're trying to solve complexity, finding commonality is a really good place to start. And there are one or two of you out there, possibly Harley O, who's saying, oh no, is he seriously suggesting such a thing as risk ops? Or worse, architecture ops? Well, I'm not sure that I would go that far, but we still have the issue that there's too much work to do and it keeps changing. So how do we know what should go into the risk funnel, and how do we replenish that risk work funnel when further capacity becomes available? Thankfully, that's a different presentation. We want to shift risk left. Every domain authority is under pressure. They all want to make things better. And the structures of SABSA attributes and domains give us the ability to make balanced or identify balanced systemic decisions. But how do we shift the risk left to know what should we do first? If there's 300 things on top priority, which one thing should I be doing right now? And some of you will have seen that presentation, identifying holistic priorities. It's called Adapting to New Normals, Architecting for Ever-Moving Goalposts. I'm not going to repeat it today. If you haven't seen it, it's on our website. But dependency model and sensitivity analysis leverages that language to demonstrate the single most beneficial course of action, whether that is strategic, planned, transformational, or unplanned. The final point then, shift risk left. Identifying the risks too late or failing to resolve dependencies between domains creates unplanned work, backlog, untreated risk, failure to grasp opportunities. So we need an integrated risk management approach through life that identifies balance and holistic priorities. I'm a couple of minutes over. The conclusion, the benefits of what we could achieve. An appropriate balance between realizing opportunities for gains while minimizing losses. An architecturally structured and comprehensive approach. Integrated and aligned risk silos to holistically embed risk management at all levels and perspectives. Traceably align risk activities to context. Customize risk thinking to be instinctive right across the enterprise culture. A method that includes and engages stakeholders in meaningful terms. Clarity and certainty of ownership and accountability. Empower risk owners to make objective, proportionate risk decisions in context. Cater for the complexity of the modern world, and create a robust method that provides preemptive early warning capability and adaptability. Those were the 8 key points as I went through. Embrace risk. We love it, it's important. The outcome of risk management should be to enable the enterprise to take risk, not to remove it. To deal with complexity, we need common language that crosses all the diverse boundaries of local jargon. Domain modeling provides clarity of ownership and authority over what really matters and accelerates decision making. Together, they create real clarity of what events, states are meaningful. You can only do that with a framework that truly integrates on an enterprise basis. Strategy demands a fundamentally different approach. It is not compliance, and shift risk left to provide priority through the risk work funnel. That's it for today. We've only scratched the surface of a very complex subject. That's my email address, david@davidlynas.com. SABSA Institute is at sabsa.org, and David Lynas Consulting for consulting, davidlynas.com, for training, sabsacourses.com, and of course the SABSA World Congress at COSAC. Thank you all very much indeed for giving me an hour and 6 minutes of your lives. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them, and I see there's one in the queue, I think. From Fred. Hey, Fred. Your presentation contains a slide that categorizes attributes in terms of people, systems, and processes. Where does that illustration leave the trusted SABSA taxonomy of attributes? The ICT business attributes, as published in the book and the white paper, Frederick, is one of a million possible attributes taxonomies. That is an example and an illustration of how attributes could be presented, but that could be done for balanced scorecard categories or risk categories or people, process, technology, or by stakeholder interest level. It's just, the taxonomy is simply a technique to communicate within culture, and the list of 80 in the book is simply one example of that. So I hope that answers your question. That's it. No more very difficult questions. You let me get away with it easily. Thank you all very much indeed. The materials will be available for download hopefully tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning UK and Ireland time. If that was valuable or has any key points for you, please do feel free to reference on social media and so on, let other people download it. Thank you all very much indeed, and hopefully I'll see you again shortly, if not on a webinar, then SABSA training or at the COSAC conference. Have a good day or have a good night in Australia and New Zealand, and thank you all very much indeed.